My name is Margaret Sullivan, and at 80 years old, I discovered that being forgotten by your own children can be the greatest gift they never meant to give you. Last Thursday should have been filled with birthday cake and grandchildren's laughter, but instead, I sat alone in my living room, watching the phone that refused to ring. What my 3 successful children didn't realize as they went about their busy lives was that their absence would trigger the most important decision I'd ever make. By the time they discovered what I'd done with my will, their frantic apologies couldn't undo the new legacy I'd created. Before I reveal the shocking changes that left them speechless, let me take you back to where this story really begins. But first, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Are you a grandmother like me? Or perhaps someone who understands the unique pain of being taken for granted by those you raised? Drop a comment below, and if you've ever felt invisible to your own family, please hit that like button. Your support means more to this old lady than you might imagine. You see, reaching 80 is supposed to be a milestone. 8 decades of life, love, losses, and lessons. I'd raised 3 children through the chaos of the 70s and 80s, survived my dear Harold's passing 12 years ago, and maintained the family home in Riverside, Connecticut, where every corner held precious memories. I'd imagined this birthday differently, perhaps a surprise party, certainly a gathering, at the very least a visit from each of my children. Instead, I woke that morning to silence. The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking each moment of my solitude. I made my own coffee, as I had every morning since Harold left, and sat at the kitchen table where I'd once served countless family meals. The empty chairs seemed to mock me, each one a reminder of the family that once filled this home with noise and life. By noon, I'd stopped checking my phone every few minutes. By evening, I'd made a decision that would change everything. Sometimes the most powerful moments in our lives come not from what happens to us, but from how we choose to respond. And my response would echo through generations in ways my children never anticipated. Life hadn't always been this quiet. The Sullivan family was once the envy of Riverside's close-knit community. Harold and I raised our 3 children, Michael, Patricia, and Jennifer, in our colonial home on Maple Street, the one with the wraparound porch and the ancient oak tree that still drops acorns on the roof every fall. We were the family that hosted 4th of July barbecues, whose Christmas lights could be seen from 2 blocks away, whose door was always open to neighborhood kids seeking cookies and Band-Aids. Michael, my eldest at 58, had become a prominent cardiologist in Boston. He'd inherited Harold's precise nature and steady hands, along with his father's tendency to become so absorbed in work that the rest of the world faded away. His wife, Catherine, came from old money, and together they'd created a life of country clubs and charity galas that felt foreign to me, though I'd always tried to show interest when they occasionally shared details. Patricia, 56, had become a successful real estate developer in New York City. My middle child had always been the fighter, the one who demanded attention, and usually got it. She'd married twice, divorced twice, and threw herself into her work with a ferocity that both impressed and worried me. Her 2 children, my grandchildren Emma and James, were teenagers now, though I'd seen them only a handful of times in the past 5 years. Jennifer, my baby at 53, lived the closest, just 40 minutes away in Greenwich, but might as well have been on another continent. She'd married into hedge fund wealth and adopted a lifestyle that revolved around yoga retreats, meditation workshops, and finding herself, though she'd been lost to me for years. Her son, Oliver, was 8 now, though the last photo I had of him was from his 5th birthday. Our family gatherings had dwindled gradually, like a tide retreating so slowly you don't notice until the water's gone. First, it was the Sunday dinners that became monthly, then quarterly, then only major holidays. Then even those became rushed affairs, with everyone checking phones and making excuses to leave early. "Mom understands," they'd say to each other, as if my understanding was a given, as if my feelings had an expiration date that coincided with my retirement. I maintained our traditions alone now, keeping Harold's memory alive in small ways. His coffee mug still in the cupboard, his reading chair still angled toward the window. But traditions need people to give them meaning, and people, I'd learned, could be remarkably good at overlooking what once mattered most. The signs had been there for years, small cracks that eventually became chasms. It started with missed phone calls that went unreturned for days, then weeks. "Sorry, Mom, you know how crazy things get," became a refrain as familiar as their childhood excuses for unfinished homework. I'd adapted, learning to treasure brief text messages like rare coins, each emoji a substitute for actual conversation. Michael's gradual disappearance began when Catherine suggested I was confused during a family dinner 5 years ago. I'd simply mentioned that their nanny seemed overwhelmed with their 3 children, having observed her near tears in their kitchen. "Mom, please don't interfere with our household management," Michael had said, his tone clinical, as if I were a patient overstepping boundaries rather than his mother offering concern. The invitations to their home stopped after that, replaced by stilted lunches at restaurants where Catherine would check her watch repeatedly. Patricia's withdrawal was more dramatic, befitting her personality. 3 years ago, I gently suggested she might be working too hard, that her children needed their mother present, not just providing. She'd exploded, accusing me of being judgmental, old-fashioned, and unsupportive of career women. "Just because you were content being a housewife doesn't mean the rest of us have to limit ourselves," she'd snapped, conveniently ignoring that I'd run a successful catering business for 20 years while raising them. We'd barely spoken since, our interactions reduced to birthday cards and obligatory holiday greetings. Jennifer's estrangement was the most puzzling. She'd simply drifted away. Each wellness retreat seemed to take her further from the daughter I'd known. She spoke in terms I didn't understand about chakras and manifestation, while showing no interest in manifesting actual time with her mother. When I'd attempted to share my own thoughts during one of her rare visits, she'd closed her eyes and told me she couldn't absorb negative energy right now. The grandchildren became strangers, their lives filtered through social media posts I sometimes saw when neighbor Betty showed me on her tablet. Emma was apparently at boarding school now, James excelling at lacrosse, Oliver learning Mandarin. Accomplishments I learned about from Facebook rather than proud parents sharing news with their mother. Yet I continued reaching out, my attempts met with increasing indifference. My calls timed to avoid their busy schedules, my texts carefully worded to not seem needy. I'd become an expert at one-sided relationships, pouring love into a void and pretending the echoes were enough. But even the strongest wells can run dry when there's no rain to replenish them. The week before my 80th birthday, I'd sent gentle reminders to each of my children. Not demands or guilt trips, just soft mentions during our increasingly rare communications. "Can you believe I'll be 80 next Thursday?" I'd said to Michael during a hurried call about my medical insurance. "That's nice, Mom," he'd replied absently. "Catherine's calling me for dinner. We'll talk soon." Patricia had responded to my text with a thumbs-up emoji. Jennifer had sent a crystal healing link and suggested I meditate on aging gracefully. On the morning of my birthday, I woke at 5 a.m., a lifetime habit that even retirement couldn't break. I'd dressed carefully in the navy dress Harold had loved, the one with small pearl buttons that were getting harder to fasten with my arthritis. I'd even applied lipstick, the coral shade Jennifer had given me years ago, back when she still noticed such things. By 7 a.m., I'd prepared a coffee cake using my mother's recipe, the one Michael used to request every birthday when he was young. The house smelled of cinnamon and memories. I set the dining room table with my good china, just in case someone surprised me. Hope, I've learned, is sometimes more stubborn than wisdom. The first call came at 9 a.m., but it was only Betty from next door, singing an off-key but heartfelt rendition of Happy Birthday. Then silence. I checked my phone repeatedly, ensuring the ringer was on, the volume high. I even called my own number from the landline to make sure it was working. Technology wasn't my strong suit, but disappointment had made me thorough. By noon, I'd moved from the dining room to the living room, positioning myself in the chair from where I could see the driveway through the lace curtains. Every car that passed made my heart jump slightly, muscle memory from decades of waiting for children to come home. The coffee cake sat untouched, its sweet scent now cloying in the empty house. At 3 p.m., a text from Patricia. Happy B-Day, Mom. In Tokyo for merger meetings. We'll call when back. No mention of when that might be. At 5 p.m., an email from Jennifer with a link to a meditation on embracing your wisdom years. No personal message. By 7 p.m., nothing from Michael at all. I sat in Harold's chair as darkness fell, not bothering to turn on the lights. The profound silence of being overlooked by those you'd given life to settled around me like a shroud. But in that darkness, something else stirred. Not sadness or self-pity, but a clarity I hadn't felt in years. If I was no longer a priority in their lives, perhaps it was time to reconsider their priority in mine. That night, alone with my uneaten birthday cake and the deafening silence, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of abandonment. The tears came slowly at first, then in waves that left me gasping. Not the gentle tears of an elderly woman, but the raw, primal grief of a mother whose children had become strangers. I cried for the little boy who used to climb into my lap with skinned knees, now too busy to remember the woman who kissed them better. I wept for the daughter who once declared I was her best friend, now treating me like an obligation she couldn't quite fulfill. I mourned for the baby girl who used to fall asleep in my arms, now finding comfort in everything but her mother's love. The photo albums came out, dangerous territory for the brokenhearted. There we were at Disney World, Michael on Harold's shoulders, the girls clutching my hands, all of us squinting in the Florida sun. There was Patricia's high school graduation, her defiant smile even then, but her hand seeking mine as we walked to the car. Jennifer's wedding, where she'd whispered, "Thank you for everything, Mom," before walking down the aisle. When had those grateful children become these indifferent adults? I found myself talking to Harold's picture on the mantle, a habit I'd developed in the early days of widowhood, but had tried to break. "They've moved on without me, Harold," I whispered. "Not just from the house, from my life." In my imagination, I could hear his practical response. "So what are you going to do about it, Maggie?" He'd never been one for wallowing, my Harold. Even cancer couldn't dim his determination to make each day count. Around midnight, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where I'd helped with countless homework assignments, bandaged scraped knees, and listened to teenage heartbreaks. The woman reflected in the dark window was someone I barely recognized. When had I become this invisible old lady, existing only on the periphery of my children's lives? When had my feelings become so disposable? But as I stared at that reflection, something shifted. The tears dried, replaced by a strange calm. I was 80 years old. How many more years did I have to waste waiting for affection that wasn't coming? How many more birthdays would I spend setting tables for guests who wouldn't arrive? Harold and I had worked hard our entire lives, saved carefully, invested wisely. We'd built something substantial, always with the intention of leaving a legacy for our children. But what if they'd already received their inheritance, a lifetime of love, support, and sacrifice, and had squandered it through indifference? The answer came with startling clarity. It was time to create a different legacy. The next morning, I woke with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. First order of business, a visit to Thomas Garrett, the family attorney who'd handled our affairs since Harold and I bought our first house. Thomas was nearly as old as I was, but sharp as ever, with kind eyes that had seen too many family disputes to be shocked by anything. "Margaret," he said, settling behind his mahogany desk, "what brings you here today?" "It's been, 3 years since we reviewed the will?" "I want to make some changes," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Significant changes." He leaned back, studying me over his glasses. "May I ask what's prompted this decision?" I told him about the birthday, but more than that, about the years of gradual abandonment. He listened without judgment, occasionally nodding. "I see this more often than you'd think," he said finally. "Children who assume inheritance is their birthright, regardless of their behavior. You have every right to distribute your assets as you see fit." We spent the morning going through my assets. The house, worth well over $1 million in today's market. The investment portfolio Harold had built so carefully. The life insurance policies. The family heirlooms. Together, it represented a substantial estate, one my children had likely already divided in their minds. "I don't want to cut them out entirely," I explained. "I'm not vindictive. But I want the bulk of my estate to go where it will be appreciated and do real good." Thomas suggested I take some time to research charitable organizations, to think carefully about this decision. But I'd done my thinking in that dark kitchen. Now was the time for action. Over the next weeks, I threw myself into research with an energy I'd thought was lost. I visited the local literacy center where I'd volunteered years ago, before my children started suggesting I was too old for such activities. The director, a young woman named Sarah, remembered me warmly and showed me their expansion plans, their dreams limited only by funding. I toured the animal shelter where Harold and I had adopted our beloved Max 20 years ago. The current director walked me through their overwhelmed facilities, explaining how many animals they had to turn away due to space and resources. I met with the food bank coordinators, visited the Veterans Assistance Program, spent time at the youth center that served at-risk teenagers. Each visit reminded me that family extended beyond blood. These organizations served their communities with more devotion than my children had shown me. They remembered names, celebrated small victories, and most importantly, they were present. As I immersed myself in the community I'd neglected while waiting for my children's attention, something remarkable happened. I began to rediscover parts of myself that had atrophied from disuse. The literacy center asked if I'd consider teaching a basic English class for new immigrants. "Just once a week," Sarah assured me, "but you'd be perfect with your patience and experience." That first Tuesday, facing a classroom of eager adults struggling with a new language, I felt more useful than I had in years. Maria from Guatemala reminded me of Patricia at that age, fierce and determined. Chen from China had Michael's meticulous attention to detail. Fatima from Syria possessed Jennifer's gentle spirit, but with a gratitude my daughter had lost somewhere along the way. After class, several students stayed behind to practice conversation. They asked about my life, genuinely interested in my stories. Maria's eyes widened when I mentioned my birthday. "Senora Margaret, 80 years is a blessing. In my culture, we celebrate our elders. You must let us throw you a party." Before I could protest, the entire class had taken up the cause. The following Tuesday, they surprised me with a multicultural feast, dishes from their homelands prepared with love. Chen had made dumplings. Fatima brought Syrian sweets. Maria's tamales were still warm. They sang "Happy Birthday" in 7 languages, and I found myself crying again, but these were tears of joy. Betty, my neighbor, had noticed my renewed energy. "You're like a different person," she observed over our weekly coffee. "What's your secret?" I shared my journey, expecting judgment. Instead, she revealed her own story of children who visited only when they needed something. "That's why I started my garden," she said, gesturing to her magnificent yard. "Plants appreciate consistent care. They bloom in response to attention, unlike some people we could mention." Through Betty, I met a network of women in similar situations. We called ourselves the Forgotten Mothers Club, though with dark humor rather than self-pity. Eleanor had been a federal judge whose children now found her stories boring. Ruth had raised 4 doctors who couldn't find time for house calls. Grace's son was a senator who mentioned her in speeches, but rarely in person. "The question," Eleanor said during one of our gatherings, "is what we do with the time and resources we have left. Waiting for crumbs of affection, or creating our own feast?" Her words resonated deeply. I'd spent so long defining myself through my children's lives that I'd lost sight of my own. These women, this community, these students, they saw me as Margaret, not just someone's mother. They valued my presence, sought my advice, celebrated my existence. It was a revelation that came just in time. 6 months after my abandoned birthday, my life had transformed beyond recognition. I taught at the Literacy Center twice a week now, my students' progress filling me with pride I hadn't felt since my own children's early accomplishments. Several had passed citizenship tests. Others had gotten better jobs with their improved English. They invited me to their celebrations, included me in their lives with an openness my own family had abandoned. The animal shelter had become another regular commitment. I couldn't handle the larger dogs anymore, but I spent hours with the cats and smaller animals, socializing them for adoption. The staff nicknamed me the Cat Whisperer after I'd managed to calm their most skittish residents. It was there I met Theodore, a grumpy senior tabby who reminded me of Harold, particular about everything but loyal once won over. After a month of visits, I adopted him, ending 12 years of living alone. My charitable giving had become strategic and personal. I established a scholarship at the Literacy Center in Harold's name. I funded the animal shelter's new senior pet adoption program, waiving fees for older adults adopting older animals. The youth center received money for their after-school tutoring program. Each donation felt like planting seeds in grateful soil. Meanwhile, communication with my children remained sporadic and surface level. Michael had finally texted a belated birthday greeting 3 weeks after the fact with a brief, "Sorry, Mom, surgical conference ran long." Patricia sent flowers a month late with a generic card signed by her assistant. Jennifer mailed a crystal she insisted would align my chakras, though what I needed aligned was her priorities. Thomas Garrett and I met monthly now, refining the will's details. He'd helped me establish a charitable trust, ensuring my giving would continue beyond my lifetime. The house would go to an organization that provided transitional housing for women escaping domestic violence. My personal belongings would be auctioned for charity, except for a few sentimental items I designate for each child. Enough to remember me by, not enough to retire on. "You're sure about this?" Thomas asked each time, his legal obligation to verify my soundness of mind. "More certain with each passing day," I'd reply. The irony wasn't lost on me. As I pulled away from my children, my life had become fuller. As I stopped waiting for their calls, my phone rang constantly with friends and community members. As I ceased being available at their convenience, I became indispensable to people who truly needed me. The mother they dismissed had become a matriarch to many, just not to them. Theodore purring in my lap, lesson plans spread before me, the phone ringing with Ruth confirming our lunch plans. This was a life worth living, and a legacy worth leaving to those who'd appreciate it. As my 81st birthday approached, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. Not for family recognition, that ship had sailed and sunk, but for the final pieces of my plan falling into place. Thomas had assured me the will was ironclad, designed to withstand any challenges. The charitable organizations had been notified of their future windfalls, though the amounts remained confidential. I'd even made provisions for Betty and my forgotten mother's friends, ensuring they'd have resources for their own final years. Then, unexpectedly, Patricia called. Not a text or email, but an actual phone call. My daughter's voice, usually brisk and businesslike, carried an unusual note. "Mom, I'm going to be in Connecticut next week for a property viewing. I thought I might stop by." I kept my voice neutral. "That would be nice, dear. When were you thinking?" "Thursday afternoon? Maybe around 2? Thursday was my literacy center day. I have a commitment until 4. You could come by after that." A pause. Patricia wasn't used to working around my schedule. "Oh, well, I suppose that works. See you then." The visit was illuminating. Patricia arrived in her Tesla, phone glued to her ear, finishing a call as she walked to the door. She air-kissed my cheek, eyes already scanning the house with her developer's assessment. I saw her notice the new furniture I'd bought, comfortable pieces chosen for my enjoyment rather than preservation for inheritance. "You've changed things," she observed, a note of accusation in her voice. "Life is for living," I replied, serving tea in everyday cups rather than the good china. I decided to enjoy my home while I can. Theodore chose that moment to make his entrance, stalking into the room with feline dignity. He assessed Patricia with yellow eyes, found her wanting, and promptly claimed my lap. Patricia's expression suggested I'd lost my mind. "You got a cat?" The dismay in her voice was almost comical. "This is Theodore. We keep each other company." She launched into tales of her latest project, barely pausing for breath. When she finally asked about my life, her eyes glazed over as I described my teaching, my volunteer work, my new friends. She perked up only when I mentioned the house's value had increased. "You really should consider downsizing, Mom. This place is too big for one person. The market is excellent right now." "I'm quite comfortable here," I said calmly, stroking Theodore. "Besides, I have plans for this house." As she left, already on another call before reaching her car, I felt the last threads of guilt dissolve. My children hadn't just missed my birthday, they'd missed who I'd become, but I'd found myself, and that was enough. That evening, I called Thomas. "I want to add one more provision, a letter to be read at the will reading. I have some things to say." 3 years later, on a crisp October morning, I suffered a stroke while preparing for my literacy class. Betty found me when I didn't answer her knock, Theodore yowling beside me. The last thing I remember was thinking I should have given her a key sooner. Then darkness, but a peaceful one. I'd lived fully these last years. I could let go without regrets. The following is from the will reading, as I'd instructed Thomas to arrange. Thomas Garrett adjusted his glasses in the conference room of Garrett and Associates, the October rain pattering against the windows. My 3 children sat before him, dressed in black but checking phones, impatient to return to their important lives. The scent of leather and old wood filled the room as Thomas cleared his throat and began with my letter. "My dear children, if you're reading this, it means you found time in your busy schedules to attend to my final affairs. I'm touched, truly, considering you couldn't manage to find time for my living presence these past years. I want you to know that I loved you completely and unconditionally. Every sacrifice was made willingly, every sleepless night endured gladly. You were my world, and I regret nothing about raising you. However, love doesn't require blindness, and unconditional doesn't mean without consequences. You taught me something valuable in my final years. That family isn't just about blood, but about presence. It's about caring enough to call, visiting when it matters, seeing your mother as a person, not just a safety net or future inheritance. Therefore, I've chosen to leave my estate to those who saw me, valued me, and included me in their lives when it mattered. The Literacy Center, where immigrants showed me more warmth than my own children. The Animal Shelter, where even the cats provided more companionship. The Youth Center, where troubled teenagers displayed more gratitude. And yes, to Betty and my dear friends who became the family you chose not to be. To each of you, I leave a small remembrance, items of sentimental value rather than monetary worth. Michael, your father's medical bag from his residency. Patricia, my mother's recipe box. Jennifer, the rocking chair where I nursed you all. May these remind you of a time when we were truly family. I forgive you for overlooking me. I hope someday you'll forgive yourselves. With love always, Mom. The silence was deafening. Then the reading of the will itself, each bequest to charity landing like a gentle slap. The house to transitional housing, the investments to various nonprofits, the car to Betty, even Theodore to Maria, who'd promised to spoil him rotten. My children's faces cycled through disbelief, anger, and perhaps, finally, understanding. In the days following the will reading, my children each processed the news differently. Michael consulted lawyers, convinced I'd been manipulated or wasn't of sound mind. Thomas calmly produced my competency evaluation, the video testimonies I'd made, the careful documentation of every decision. The legal challenge died before it began. Patricia calculated lost millions, her developer's mind spinning through what-ifs and should-haves. But she remembered that Thursday visit, how she'd seen the house as future inventory rather than her mother's home, how she'd been more interested in property values than my new life. The guilt stung more than the financial loss. Jennifer claimed she felt my spirit was at peace with this decision, retrofitting spiritual meaning onto material consequences. But perhaps she finally understood that all the crystals and meditation links couldn't substitute for actual presence, real connection, real love demonstrated through action rather than accessories. They left Thomas's office changed, whether they admitted it or not. Every future family gathering, every Mother's Day, every birthday would carry the weight of recognition. That love requires action, that presence matters, that inheritance is earned through relationship, not birthright. I'd like to think Michael started calling his own children more often, suddenly aware of how easily connection fades. That Patricia surprised her teenagers by attending their events, remembering a mother who would have treasured such invitations. That Jennifer discovered mindfulness means being present for people, not just personal enlightenment. The organizations I'd chosen fought successfully for their bequests, knowing what they meant. My students graduated using scholarship funds. Abandoned animals found homes. Hungry families ate. Women fleeing violence found shelter in the house where I'd once waited for children who didn't come. Betty tended my garden, as promised. The forgotten mothers toasted me at their gatherings with the good wine I'd made sure they could afford. Maria sent photos to Betty of Theodore in his new home, fat and loved. The Literacy Center hung my portrait in Harold's memorial classroom, where immigrants would learn English, beneath the watching eyes of someone who understood reinvention. This is legacy, not just money passed down through blood, but impact rippling through communities. Not just inheritance, but inspiration. Not just an ending, but a beginning for so many who needed what my children had thoughtlessly wasted. Someone who believed in them. My story became a cautionary tale in Riverside, whispered at coffee shops and book clubs. Parents called their adult children more often. Children visited aging parents more frequently. The Forgotten Mothers Club grew as women realized they had power over their own narratives, their own legacies, their own final chapters. Dear friends who've stayed with me through this story, I hope you understand that this isn't about revenge or bitterness. It's about recognition that we all have the power to rewrite our narratives, even in our final chapters, especially in our final chapters. If you're a parent whose calls go unanswered, whose birthdays pass unnoticed, whose presence has become optional in your children's lives, know this: your worth isn't determined by their attention. You raised them to be independent, and perhaps you succeeded too well. But your story doesn't end with their departure. There's a whole world waiting for your wisdom, your time, your care. Somewhere, there's a literacy student struggling with English who needs your patience, an animal shelter where lonely creatures need your gentle touch, a youth center where troubled teens need someone to believe in them, a neighbor who needs a friend, communities that will celebrate your birthdays with joy rather than obligation. Don't wait for crumbs of affection from those who should feast at your table. Set new tables, invite new guests, create a different kind of family, one bound by choice, gratitude, and presence rather than genetics and assumption. And yes, consider your legacy carefully. You worked hard for what you have. You sacrificed to build something substantial. That gives you the right, no, the responsibility to ensure it goes where it will be valued, where it will make a difference, where it will honor not just your memory, but your values. To those children who might recognize themselves in my story, it's not too late. That mother you've been meaning to call? Call her. That father whose stories you've heard a dozen times? Listen again. Those grandparents you assume will always be there? They won't. Time is the only real inheritance, and it's slipping away with every too busy and maybe next week. My name was Margaret Sullivan. I lived 83 meaningful years. I raised 3 children who overlooked me but found myself in their absence. I died surrounded not by family portraits, but by thank you letters from students, photos of adopted pets and happy homes, and plans for community programs that would continue my work. That, my dear friends, is a life well lived and a death well planned. I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Have you faced similar situations? How did you reclaim your narrative? And please, if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the best inheritance we can leave is the wisdom to value ourselves when others won't. Remember, it's never too late to rewrite your will or your life. The pen is in your hand. Use it wisely.